Um, on behalf of Chandigarh Literary Society, it gives me immense pleasure to have you join us from various parts of India and the world for a very special conversation. I am extremely happy, and it is an honor to have a friend and a highly erudite scholar on board with us, Professor Meher Afshan Farooqi from Charlottesville, University of Virginia, United States of America. और इनके लिए दिन का वक्त है और हमारा सायंकाल का. So a very good morning to you and welcome on behalf of CLS to a lovely evening of scintillating conversation, I hope.
Adab, namaste and sat sri akal. It's my pleasure to be here in conversation with you, Suparna. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm looking forward very much to interacting with the audience and with you.
Shukriya. For the benefit of our readers and some of us who are not acquainted with the body of work and the scholarship that Meher enriches everybody with, इलाहाबाद की रहने वाली हैं. इस वक्त, as I mentioned, अमेरिका में है और खास तौर से जो पढ़ाती हैं वहाँ, that should be an area of interest to most of you. It is Urdu, language, literature, and South Asian cultural literary studies. It is an area which I think has a very vast gambit of topics, and the subject that we have today with us is one which has a predominance not only as an author and a scholar, but as somebody who has a very, very close contact with the kind of Hindustani इतिहास, हिंदुस्तानी वाकफियत तहजीब की. मैं इनकी बात कर रही हूँ. गालिब, critical biography, a wilderness at my doorstep. That is the title, and the book is extremely fascinating, to say the least. Incidentally, I must share with you, Meher, आपके जो कवर पर जिन्होंने बहुत ही pleasing statement दिया है, an instant classic by the acclaimed historian Muzaffar Alam, वो मेरे गुरु रह चुके हैं. Yes, मध्यकालीन इतिहास पढ़ने का सौभाग्य मुझे हुआ और उनके क्लास में होने का मौका मिला. One of my favorite teachers. So thank you for this wonderful book, and I will begin straight off. You begin the book with a fairly elaborate and a detailed timeline which is just not dates, but it is also dipping into why anything to do with Ghalib from the aspect that you are addressing. This timeline is an integral preface. Your thoughts?
Yeah, the timeline was important because it was necessary to highlight the publication trajectory of Ghalib, which is one of the important things that I was focusing on, because as you might have seen by reading the book, that I am one of the ideas that I have pushed in this book is that an important reason for Ghalib's extraordinary popularity, in spite of being a difficult poet, is his steady publication history, and how frequently he was published, and what was and also the comparison between his Urdu and his Persian works comes out very well when you look at the timeline, because you see that he's publishing so much in Persian. and in Urdu it is basically the Diwan, and only later on, very late in his life, his Urdu letters are published.
जी
So
जी
I think that was the reason to have this as a tool to help readers get a sense of the enormous amount of work that Ghalib did also.
Oh, of course. In fact, अच्छा हुआ आपने जिक्र किया difficult. I have with me this quote by none other than Dr. Gopi Chand Narang. As a foreword, he wrote for Gulzar's book, which is titled Mirza Ghalib, एक स्वनाही मंजरनामा. And in that, the opening statement is, गालिब जितने मकबूल हैं उतने ही मुश्किल भी हैं.
Hmm.
So his popularity and his complexity, this duality plays out very well in the perspective that you have taken. I'm now curious to ask you, आपने गालिब को छेड़ने का जो या छेड़ने की जैसे उर्दू में कहा जाता है हिमाकत की है, वो 10 साल की उम्र से जब पहली बार आपकी वाकफियत हुई थी आपके वालिद साहब
जी.
रहमान फरूकी साहब के साथ, एक नज्म उन्होंने कहा कि आप इसे याद कीजिए. Do share something about that. Was that the trigger to start this journey?
No, I don't think that was the trigger. It was something that stayed with me. The term mustarad, which is a very unfamiliar word, you know. I mean, for a child, especially, something that has been जिसको रद्द कर दिया गया, मुस्तरद.
जी
तो उन्होंने मुझे एक कुछ अशार दिए एक गज़ल से और कहा कि इनको याद कर लो. और फिर मैंने जब उन्हें सुनाया तो उन्होंने कहा कि ये गालिब के मुस्तरद कलाम में से है, तो और समझाया कि ये, तो ठीक है, मैंने सोचा, मैंने उस खास उसके बारे में उस वक्त तो ज़ाहिर है नहीं सोचा.
जी
और बरसों गुजर गए यहाँ तक कि मैं हिंदुस्तान छोड़ करके आई स्टार्टेड यू नो माय एकेडमिक करियर इन द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स एंड mostly I was interested in offering courses on modern Urdu literature
जी
because uh, there's more of a interest in things that are happening around us and the contemporary scene. At least here, I realized that students were more interested. It just so happened that a friend and a senior scholar, Frances Pritchett, was who has done a lot of work on Ghalib. She was retiring, and there was a conference in her honor, and I had to give a paper. And I thought, you know, what can I write about Ghalib? So much has been written already. How can I say something that is new? And then the word Mustarad came to my mind, and I thought, you know, what can I write about the Mustarad? So that had lasted in my mind for so many years.
So
And I,
a sort of a discarded content
Hmm.
provoked you to sort of have a a fountain of magnificence. I mean, the kind of poetry and compositions that one gets to read, it's fantastic. And to think that somebody, अगर किसी का discarded ये है तो माशाल्लाह जी, बाकी की तो बात ही कुछ और है. जी
और मैं एक बात आपको और बताऊं कि अपनी राइटिंग को डिस्कार्ड करना कितना मुश्किल होता है.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल
किसी ने कहा है, बल्कि हाली जो खुद बहुत बड़े शायर और गालिब के पहले सबसे पहले बायोग्राफर हैं, हाली उन्होंने किताब लिखी यादगार गालिब,
जी
which was published in 1890s. So उन्होंने कहा कि ये गालिब के दिल के टुकड़े उन्होंने कैसे जुदा किए होंगे क्योंकि
बहुत खूब बहुत खूब बिल्कुल
तो मुझे भी लगता है कि ये बहुत ही मुश्किल काम था जो गालिब ने खुद किया, और
जी
इसमें उन्होंने बहुत सारे ऐसे खूबसूरत नगीने भी डिस्कार्ड कर दिए. तो
ट्रू
मेरा काम जो था वो शुरू इसी तरह से हुआ, टू रीडिस्कवर गालिब through his rejected corpus. And I was not expecting that he would have discarded more than half of his Urdu poetry. I was thinking that there would be like maybe let's say
It's
a
a
round number of 50 ghazals. Let's say he discarded 50 ghazals. Let's say he discarded 200 verses. But then I found that he discarded more than 2,000 verses, which is almost more than a little bit more than his half of his.
entire, yes, that's
Mm,
right. Which is also an indication that what a hard taskmaster on himself.
yes,
What a hard taskmaster, which is
very
an
strict.
excellent,
I call him a
absolutely.
very strict editor of his own work. So from that point, I started traveling towards other questions which began to bother me because why didn't he do the same with his Persian? Why didn't he be a strict editor on his Persian? Why did he select this verse and not that verse? Because in order to do that, I had to look at all of his manuscripts, and fortunately, we have a fair number of them available to us. So I started looking at what I'm calling the manuscript divans, and I'm seeing the editorial process that Ghalib followed, which is very fascinating, because that ghazal that is very famous, Naqsh Faryadi hai kiski shokhi tahreer ka,
जी
kaghaze
जी
hai
जी
pehrahani, har pe kare tasveer ka. So that is the opening ghazal in his divan, and it originally consisted of 9 or I think 11 verses, and Ghalib took out so many, and he presented only 5. So that in itself was interesting for me. And if you change the order of Ghalib's Divan, it is not something that it's this is something also that I was interested in, because what if there was some other ghazal instead of Naqsh Faryadi as the first?
exactly, right. I think the
That
entire
doesn't seem
trajectory
right.
would have been a different
Yeah,
imprint
it
altogether.
doesn't seem right.
No,
So there was a certain order in which he placed the ghazals, and that is important. And these are new things that I explored in my book, because in spite of all the work that has been done on Ghalib, nobody has worked on these aspects of his
no, no, that's very true. In fact, जब आप कहती हैं critical biography, that itself gives, for want of a better term, a technical gaze
Hmm.
to what you are addressing. And that brings me to my next query, which is आप linguistic paradox की बात करती हैं और ये वो शायर है जिन्हें जिसे कहते हैं he defines poetry in Urdu particularly
Hmm.
the greatest. Uh, so what what is it that you are trying to tell a layman for whom uh, a buzurg shayer is a dost because of what he writes and the succinct meaning in his couplets वो एक राहगीर भी जाते जाते अपने दिल के अरमान जाहिर कर देता है और एक आलम फाजिल भी बैठा हुआ एक बैठक में अपनी शोहरत के कुछ दाने कमा सकता है सो do throw some light on that linguistic paradox aspect and what is it that you're trying to say.
So I have been interested in bilingualism for some time, and of course, as an Indian, we always know more than one language because of our immense cultural and linguistic diversity. So we grow up typically, right, with 3 languages,
Correct.
but we don't write in all 3 languages. So we tend to have a preferred language in which we write. We can speak in more than one, and this is something that I was looking at Ghalib, that he is writing in 2 languages. He's writing in Persian and he's writing in Urdu. And despite the fact that there is a lot of overlap between the 2 languages, but culturally they have different underpinnings. And
True.
so if you look at his Farsi poetry, he tends to be more of a classicist in that.
Hmm.
And in Urdu, he is more of a experimenter and a maker and breaker, because he feels that he has the authority to bend the language as much as he wants. He has the authority to bring in as many new words. He makes up new words and expressions and usages. So these things were noticeable to me. And the third thing that happened to me writing this book is that I am dealing with three languages at the same time because I'm
Correct.
constantly mediating between Urdu and Persian and English, and I'm trying to
That's quite a
somehow,
tripod.
yeah. So that was one of the biggest challenges that I faced, and I feel that we don't give enough credit to translators in all academia. That the kind of work that they do is very hard. Moving from one language to another language is not easy. It is
Right.
a paradox. Yes, I think that's what I was trying to share with my readers. How how challenging it is. It seems simple, but it's
Choice of words as it is in writing is an art. I
yeah.
mean, to express what you are keen to highlight with the right
Mm,
usage is a skill. Very few have it, and right. Um, I'm also interested in knowing from you that the chapterization is very methodical. It has a proper framework. There's a blueprint, very unique from the term that you use in your book, Galibians. पहले तो उसके बारे में थोड़ा सा बताइए. How, who, in your opinion, is a Galibian?
People have spent their lifetimes working on Ghalib, and
जी,
there are some very important scholars. The most important, I would say, is Malik Ram, and he has done phenomenal work writing Ghalib's biography, editing Ghalib's Diwans. And then there is Maulana Arshi from Rampur. He was the
जी,
librarian of the Raza Library, and so the Rampur Library has the richest collection of Ghalib, Ghalib's
Ghalib.
work because Nawab of Rampur was his patron.
Right,
So Arshi Sahab's edition of Ghalib's Diwan is the most complete edition, and he
okay,
brought it out first in 1954, I think, and then
right,
again in 1980s. Apart from that, there's Kali Das Gupta Raza, who also spent his lifetime collecting Ghalib and writing about Ghalib. Then, of course, we have my father, who did
जी,
not spend his lifetime on Ghalib, but he did a very pioneering commentary on Ghalib called Tafhim-e Ghalib, in which he set the tone for analyzing poetry. And later on, he went to do his four-volume work on Mir. So, and then, I mean, there's a Qazi, Qazi Abdul Wadud. There are many scholars who I want to generally use the word Ghalibian because they have really contributed immensely. And I am
right,
nothing compared to them. I am nothing compared to them. It's just that I learned from their work, and sitting outside of the cultural milieu, I asked certain questions which were probably there on the surface, but when you are surrounded with things, and I don't know how it works, but sometimes distance plays an important role in
sure,
perception.
sure,
So
sure,
I think I distance helped me in
right.
framing my
And,
questions.
and as far as chapterization is concerned, what was it that gave you the marker to have each chapter
Hmm.
focus on a particular aspect, a technique of his compositions,
Mhm.
whether it's prose or poetry? How
Yeah,
did that happen? Please take us through.
it wasn't very easy because I didn't write them in the sequence. It's very sequential, but I
Yes,
didn't write
it's
them. I wrote,
absolutely the opposite which comes across. Interesting, very fascinating.
yeah, I probably wrote chapter six first, and then maybe did second. So I wrote them at different times depending on my research material, whatever I was getting at that time. I had a
Correct.
general framework, and then when I was pretty close to finishing the book, I realized that there was still something that I hadn't really looked at. And that was the introductions or the prefaces that Ghalib had written to his divans. Like for every divan, there was a preface, and that was in Persian. And that Persian was so difficult that I couldn't crack it by
Yes,
myself. So I needed the help of
the
scholars
Persian scholar.
We
Yes.
specialize in this special Indo-Persian, because it's not just Persian scholars couldn't help me, and it's
Correct.
a specialized subject. So in that process, it took me more than I think it took me like 2 years to work
Wow.
through those vibhachas,
But
and
in fact,
it was
yes,
worthwhile
please.
because then I actually had access to Ghalib's own thoughts. What
Ji,
Ghalib thinking about his own poetry? What were
ji,
Ghalib's views about poetry in general?
ji.
What were his views about Urdu and Persian?
Right.
Because one of the collections which very few people know about is called Gule Rana, which is the two-colored rose. And that is the only collection in which he has both his Persian and his Urdu together. And
Correct.
in the introduction or in the preface, he talks about a garden. He says there is this beautiful garden of poetry, and it has two doors. One door opens to Urdu, and the other door opens to Farsi. So all of these things, I was, no one has translated all this
Yes. Yes.
because it was so difficult.
Yes.
So
And I
people,
think हाँ आप छेड़ना नहीं चाहते हो बिकॉज एक तो सब्जेक्ट इतना इंटिमिडेटिंग है ऊपर से अगर आपसे कोई गलती हो गई तो आप आपको बख्शा नहीं जाएगा योर रेपुटेशन एज एट स्टेक आई थिंक दिस इज इंडिकेटेड इन हिज टेम्परामेंट at the court the smugness with which he interacts with Zoc
yeah,
and the you know the intellectual banter and evaluating each other's works in the presence of the emperor. I think this is one point which what you're saying about Persian comes across that he cannot suffer the Indianized dent of the language, and he's not allowing anybody, however high and mighty and prestigious and coveted the person be, and कहीं भी हो मतलब बादशाह की presence में अगर नहीं कबूल है तो बख्शना नहीं है बोल देना है उसमें no thought and no sparing, which I think is phenomenal as a personality.
yeah. I mean, he was arrogant, but at the same time, he was very vulnerable also. So criticism hurt him deeply, and I think his response was through arrogance. That was one thing that I found. The other thing is that even in today's culture, I think we are competitive with our peers. People in the same field. So if I'm a poet, I am naturally concerned about my fellow poets, and the institution of a mushaira was basically a space where you projected your skills as a poet.
Right.
And there was a sense of outdoing one another.
जी
When you were
जी
performing and all the wahwas were coming, there was this sense of kisne mushaira luta.
हाँ
Who
बिल्कुल
turned out to be the popular. And the
yes
same thing with Kavi Sammelan, so it was culturally, these things are different from the West, where reading poetry is more personal and a private act. In our culture, because of the predominance of oral.
जी
Um,
मैं थोड़ा सा फिर से वापस जाती हूँ डेट लाइन में गालिब की डेट ऑफ बर्थ को लेकर जो कंट्रोवर्सी है
yeah.
वो इतनी अहमियत क्यों रखती है ना सिर्फ आपके काम में पर by and large on the discourse of Ghalib and his work. Why is that such a pivot?
Because it's not so pivotal. Because I think in the end, I realized that the difference between the projected date and the actual date might just be 2, 3 years, not more than that.
जी,
But because we follow the lunar calendar, both in our culture,
yes,
so there's a shift every year, and also we did not believe in projecting dates. We were, because the concept of time is continuous, and it doesn't, we don't do the periodization the way the West does. So
जी,
these things were not considered important. And Ghalib date of birth came out much later in 1845 when his Persian Diwan was published. That's when And with the British influence, I think it was more important that, you know, you have your date of birth and you have your names,
Correct.
your family. Otherwise, we went more by single names.
Mm.
I mean, Ghalib's name is Asadullah Khan, but we just know him by his Ghalib or Momin or
Yes, yes.
Zafar, you know, or just take
Sure.
anybody. Uh,
Yeah, sure,
we
sure.
we tend to do it that way. So
Right.
it was just the idea that people who have worked before me, gone before me, didn't put question marks on the discrepancies. You know, when did he move to Delhi? Was he really married at age 13 or was he married at age 15 or 17? Because there's a difference between 13 and even 15. And
Sure.
also puts the year of his moving from Agra to Delhi.
Really. Yes.
Certain other little details, you know, some people think he never bought a house, but actually he did have own a house in the beginning, and because his in-laws were very, very rich.
Mm.
And that's another aspect of Ghalib's life that I have highlighted in my book, his relationships with his in-laws. And his father-in-law was a poet, and believe it or not, Zauq was the ustad of his father-in-law when Zauq
Oh,
was very young. Hmm. So these were very interrelated literary and marital and, you know, social ties. And because Ghalib's father died very young, and then his uncle died 4 years later, the family did fall on harder times, and
gee,
Ghalib felt this, um, especially when he was surrounded by relatives who were so rich.
gee.
हम्म, ये सब
Uh, जी,
जी जी नहीं, मैंने कहा कि इस इन सब चीजों पे ज्यादा बात हुई नहीं थी,
कोई
तो
नहीं है। तो एक
वो
ट्रेंड
चीजें,
से अलग हट के आप जब
हाँ
सवाल करते हैं, देन क्वाइट ऑब्वियसली आप रिसर्च एनहांस ही नहीं कर रहे हैं, बल्कि आप एक दृष्टिकोण
हाँ
अ, लोगों से कह रहे हैं that change the perspective and your gaze. अब्दुल रहमान बिजनौरी साहब ने बहुत ही बढ़िया ये स्टेटमेंट गालिब के बारे में कहा, which I think is so profound, and I'd like to just read it so that I don't misinterpret the meaning. And as you write it in your book, India has just two scriptures or divine gospels, the Holy Ved and the Divan-e Ghalib. Now, this, to my mind, is a tremendous statement made by, again, a thespian. एक तरफ प्राचीन आपकी ज्ञान का भंडार स्रोत है आपका, वेदों को कहा जा रहा है, और दूसरी तरफ आप चचा गालिब को खड़ा कर रहे हैं, तो ये स्पेक्ट्रम कवर हो जाता है of just about everything. For
yeah.
somebody who's written on him, what do you have to say to that?
Yes, you know, he actually says, he goes on to expand on this, and he says that there is nothing within the 100 odd pages that make up Ghalib's Diwan in which you can't find something very profound about life and its challenges. Because देखिए, गालिब का जो खैर सबसे मशहूर इस सिलसिले में जो शेर है, शायद आपने सुना होगा, न था कुछ तो खुदा था, कुछ न होता तो खुदा होता, डुबोया मुझको होने ने, न मैं होता तो क्या होता.
क्या होता है? बिल्कुल.
And so on, you know, गालिब है कहाँ तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम यार, अब हमने दश्त इम्का को एक नक्शे पा पाया. So the imagination is boundless.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There is no limit to imagination. And so the human intellect is very, very superior, and it can even go to the lengths of, you know, the creator and the created के दरमियान क्या फासला है. इसके अलावा गालिब ने लैंग्वेज के ऊपर बहुत गहरी बातें कही हैं, यू नो, लैंग्वेज एंड
जैसे
साइलेंस
कि जी,
के
जैसे
दरमियान,
कि
व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन साइलेंस and language, and what is something that silence can highlight but language can't reach.
Language cannot. Yes.
So all of these things, and besides this, I think Bijnori was trained overseas, and he came back again with a perspective slightly different. And he also compared Ghalib to Goethe, to Milton, to other poets from the West, because till then we were not really comparing ourselves with beyond the pale of South Asian literature. So he also did that. Unfortunately, he died in the flu pandemic, so he was very young and he passed away.
Right. Um, आप जिक्र कर रही हैं कि the complexity of Ghalib's poetry is also, as I mentioned, the duality is also the point of attraction for somebody to get familiar with him. And to that extent, as a writer, did this book transform you?
This is a very good question. So from the beginning, my childhood was exceptional because I was the daughter of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, and he made it a point to educate me and my sister in the classical literary masters of our tradition. So I grew up reading a lot of poetry. Most of it I didn't understand at that time, but as I grew older and I reread those things, I began to internalize poetry.
जी,
But when I wrote this book, that is when I was actually focusing on each and every word, and my uh, it became very profound, this experience of having the Divana Ghalib by my bedside and reading at odd times and thinking about so many things that Ghalib has said was indeed a life changing experience for me. I'm writing a second book on Ghalib too
oh
because
wow, but you can't be done with him in just
no, I think I can't be done with one book is not enough. There were so many things that I couldn't cover in one book because you can't, as you said, the chapters, it has to have some kind of a sequence. You can't shove everything into one book. So I think the second book is
wonderful.
having
We
its
look
worth.
forward.
Yes.
Look forward. कितना वक्त लगा था इस किताब को from the time you started the research and to
It took
writing it?
about 8 years to get the book into its form. And then
Mashallah.
it takes more than a year, 2 years almost nearly to
Of
publish
course,
it because it goes through so many texts.
crafts. Yes, of course. There's a beautiful sharing in your acknowledgement that you, with your father, um had these exchanges where heated arguments and his point of view and his critical insights into why you are sort of insisting on a type of
Mm,
uh, an observation. Do share something about that because daughters and fathers have a very unique relationship and उसमें ज़्यादातर मोहब्बत और का जज्बा ओवरवेलमिंग होता है
mm,
लेकिन जब दो creatively enthused spirits
mm,
who happen to be also related
mm.
rather closely and in their own fields they are well known people, so how does that play out, the personal and the professional, and Ghalib of course?
So we had so many discussions, and both in India and in Charlottesville because he used to visit me and stay here, and we used to have wonderful like we used to start drinking tea in the morning and continue to drink tea till 11, 11 o'clock. I don't know how many cups of tea we consumed. And the discussion was, I was also taking his help in reading those difficult passages in Persian. And
जी,
sometimes he would say, इससे क्या फायदा है, ये तो सिर्फ लफाजी है, इसमें
जी,
इससे कुछ नहीं निकलेगा, तभी तो किसी और ने इसको किया नहीं है। हमने कहा नहीं, हमें तो करना ही करना है, लफाजी नहीं है, हम इसमें से चीजें निकालेंगे। तो वो कहते थे कि अच्छा तुम गालिब के दिमाग में घुस जाओगी। That's what you want to do. I said yes, I want to get into Ghalib's brain. I want to think like Ghalib. I want to so yeah, we had these discussions, and then I also badgered him a lot about Ghalib's why did he do this, why did he मुस्तरद क्यों किया उन्होंने, तो my father said, अरे वो बस उन्होंने ऐसे ही कर दिया मुस्तरद, वो नशे में थे, उन्होंने सब काट कूट करके अलग कर दिया।
which could possibly be a very accurate,
It could be,
you
really
know,
it could be.
that,
Because
that
at the end of the day, who knows?
exactly, who knows? Who knows the truth of the matter? Very right. Bilkul sahi. Let's come to the second dimension of Ghalib, which many people may or may not be acquainted with, his letter writing. And that's a huge, huge contribution
Yeah.
from a literary point of view. Uh, and today's day and age, when technology dominates all aspects of human existence, something as personal, as engaging, as intimate as letter writing is lost. And उसके बारे में थोड़ा सा विस्तार से बताइए कि how and why did that aspect
Okay.
have such an important position in your book?
So I think we learn a lot about Ghalib through his letters, and the first big batch of letters are those that he wrote when he began his journey to Calcutta. Because traveling to Calcutta meant 3,000 kilometers, and in
Yes,
those days he traveled. He traveled on horseback. He traveled on boat. He walked. He did, there were different modes of traveling, and he had to stop along the way. It took more than a year to get to Calcutta. And in this
जी,
process, he wrote a lot of letters back home to friends. He gave details. He wrote poetry also. But all the letters from this period are in Persian because Urdu prose was still a fledgling. Urdu was very developed as a language of poetry, but there wasn't much prose in Urdu. So we have the first batch of huge number of letters, and he describes Calcutta in great detail, and that is why they're so important because you get a sense of Calcutta's academic life, literary life through Ghalib's letters. Then, towards the later part of his life, when he became old and weak, he again took to writing a lot of letters to friends, especially after 1857, when the condition of Delhi, sorry, after the 1857 rebellion was so bad. He wrote a lot of letters, and this time he preferred Urdu.
जी,
So the Urdu letters themselves have been organized into 4 volumes. It's so voluminous. So you can imagine the amount of output and the
phenomenal,
genius, yes, and the genius,
absolutely,
because there was no model in front of him of letter writing in Urdu. He
right,
created the model. So
right,
in this case, he gave something very important to Urdu, a model for writing letters in a very casual, friendly way, because the Persian style was very formal and the Urdu style was very friendly and casual. Like Jawab ka Talib Ghalib, and
that kind of thing.
and yeah, I mean, अरे भाई शुरू करना इस तरह से, तो बहुत ही उनके जो लेटर्स थे वो बहुत दिल को छूते हैं।
बेहतरीन, जी,
हम्म।
जी, right. Uh, in popular psyche, I think in India, many people sat up and took note of Ghalib's work and Ghalib as a personality with two visual specimens. One, of course, the black and white Bharat Bhushan starrer Mirza Ghalib Sorafli की फिल्म, जिसकी पॉपुलैरिटी की वजह से आपने जैसे लिखा है कि his resting place had a proper installation after the release of the film,
after
but
the
we are talking
success
about
of
1955, yes, 1955. And second is Gulzar's serial, uh, with Nasiruddin Shah portraying the character. In दोनों के दायरे में the common thread for somebody who has a vague idea of Ghalib is Gurbat, Muflisi, Beolad, seven children, none survived, hand to mouth existence, um, arrogance, we mentioned, uh, the genius at play all the time, the ordinariness of being human, masjid के चौखट पर जाना, पर अंदर ना जाना, लौट आना, और बहुत अजीबो गरीब किस्म का अपने आप को पनिश करने का जो तरीका, दैट मुझसे खुदा नाराज है, by being an exceptional human being, जो भी किसी के पास जरूरत की चीज हो वो इतनी आसानी से दे देना, knowing that you will be left with nothing, is a rarity, and here this man would be doing that. Or idiosyncrasies like आमों का शौक, and and taking a jibe by at the bystander who says आप आम ही खाते हैं, तो गधे ही आम नहीं खाते हैं, that kind of thing. So आपसे जानना मुझे जरूरी लगेगा कि कहाँ है ये वाला गालिब आपकी लेखनी में?
देखिए, जो गरीबी का जो जिक्र है गालिब का, वो बहुत एग्जैजरेटेड है। वो गरीब इतने नहीं थे, वो बहुत खर्राच थे, बहुत दरिया दिल थे। इस वजह से जो थोड़ी बहुत हार्डशिप उनको होती थी महीने के आखिर में, एक तो उनके टेस्ट बहुत एक्सपेंसिव थे, वो सिर्फ अंग्रेजी शराब पीते थे, शैम्पेन और पता नहीं क्या क्या, तो वो बहुत महंगी थी। इसके अलावा उन्हें जो उनके उनकी जो फिक्स्ड इनकम थी वो कोई इतनी बुरी नहीं थी। बस ये था कि उनके जो रिश्तेदार थे वो बहुत अमीर थे, और उनको हमेशा ये बात चुभती थी कि वो उनकी और मदद क्यों नहीं करते, और जो वजीफा उनके ऊपर तय हुआ था, जो उनके चचा छोड़ के गए थे, उसमें कुछ गड़बड़ कर दी गई थी, तो उससे वो बहुत नाराज रहते थे। और बच्चे नहीं, जिस जमाने में उनके नहीं, अब वो सब टेस्टिंग तो तब थी नहीं कि जिससे पता चलता है कि ऐसा क्यों हुआ। लेकिन उन्होंने अपने नेव्यूज को उन्होंने अडॉप्ट कर लिया था, तो उनके पास 2 बच्चे थे जिनको कि वो बहुत चाहते थे, उनको बिल्कुल जान निसार करते थे। ये सब चीज़ें आम डॉक्यूमेंट्री में इतना ज़्यादा उस पर जोर नहीं दिया गया है। उनकी गरीबी पे ज़्यादा कि उनकी बीवी गहने बेच रही हैं, ऐसा नहीं कुछ था। बल्कि बाद जब 1857 हुआ तो उनकी बीवी ने जो उनके गहने थे वो गाड़ दिए एक जगह घर के अंदर। मतलब उस ज़माने में लोग ये करते थे ना, गड्ढा खोद करके गाड़ दिया। फिर जब वो वापस वो लोग गए तो वो कुछ नहीं था वहाँ पर, वो सब चोरी हो चुके थे। यानी she did have those ornaments till 1857, and they were enough. So I think the poverty part has been exaggerated. Um, the story of his love affair with the Domini, I'm sure there was a love affair because these were accepted things in those times.
Yes, yes, yes.
It was a part of social interaction to, these were forms of entertainment and patronage. People went there. But one thing that I want to share with our viewers and audiences is that Ghalib had एक चीज जिससे किसी शायर की इम्पोर्टेंस तय की जाती थी, वो ये भी होती थी कि उसके कितने शागिर्द हैं।
जी।
गालिब के टू डेट सबसे ज्यादा शागिर्द, इतने ज्यादा शागिर्द किसी के नहीं है जितने गालिब के थे. So in fact, Malik Ram has actually done a book on Ghalib's Shagirds.
Wow.
Huh,
So, what is there a number that we can quote?
I can't tell you from the top of my head because
But
somebody will
just
say
a
that's a
very
wrong
rough.
number. But yeah, they were definitely way beyond anyone else's. Some, of course, he took on just for the sake of um, their importance, and he was too old by then. But the numbers
Correct.
were phenomenal. And you know, after 1850, he had a stipend from the court. He
Gee,
had a stipend from the heir apparent. Of course, 1857 put an end to all of that. So for 7 years, literally his income was pretty good, and
sure.
he was, you know, if you see किस तरह का वो खाना खाते थे, तो वो उसी से पता चल जाता है कि बहुत उम्दा खाना खाते थे वो. बहुत खास
Gee,
किस्म का होता था.
right. Um, Lastly, I think we're almost coming to a close with our. I could go on and on because there is lots more that I'd like to, but we can leave it for another time. The print industry, the fact that during his lifetime, he was very insistent that that aspect, that his work not just be left in manuscripts handwritten, but the printing aspect, वो आपने बहुत अच्छे से और बहुत डिटेल तरीके से फोकस किया है अपने किताब में. उसके बारे में थोड़ा जिक्र कीजिए प्लीज.
देखिए उस
How
जमाने
does
में,
it impact and influence the
so the biggest publisher in those times was Munshi Nawal Kishore. He was based in Lucknow, and he had this phenomenal Nawal Kishore press. And Munshi Nawal Kishore travels to Delhi to meet with Ghalib personally. It's not that easy, you know, in those days to travel from Lucknow to Delhi.
oh,
So he
the
came.
logistics are different. Yes,
Yes, he
very.
met with Ghalib, and Ghalib discussed the handing over of his various divans to Munshi Nawal Kishore Press. And Munshi Sahab gave him, you know, importance by publishing advertisements of Ghalib's forthcoming work on the front page of Awadh Ikhbar, the newspaper, Dilli Ikhbar, sorry, Dilli Ikhbar that Munshi Nawal Kishore had from Lucknow. So in those days, to have a newspaper pushing your accomplishments, you can imagine the wide press publicity that Ghalib got. It's incomparable to anyone from his among his peers. The notice of Ghalib's, whenever he was given some award or khilat or recognition, it was always on the front page. And then when Ghalib passed away, the notices of the obituaries were filled pages and pages in the press. And so the press played a very important role in preserving Ghalib's importance and also in disseminating his work. And this needs to be studied even further and more carefully than I have done, because my book wasn't solely about Ghalib and
Of
Munshi Nawal
course.
Kishore, but it could be a study undertaken by someone else. Ghalib even sent one of his shagirds to Munshi ji, and Munshi Sahab employed him in his press. And you know, there's all this correspondence between them. It's a fascinating archive, um, and uh, I feel there is still more that can be done on Ghalib. We are still scratching the surface.
Of course. आपने the chapter on stories, किस्से जो है on collecting and finding out which manuscript worked its way to which location and through
Mm.
hands and so on itself is it draws a picture in your mind कि एक इंसान के काम को लेकर 1969 में कोई उसको 25 रुपए में बेच रहा है
Mm.
मार्केट में ओरिजिनल को, और फिर उसकी भावबाजी 11 रुपए की हो रही है टिल इट गेट्स डिस्कवर्ड कि ये सामान है क्या. I
Right.
mean, it is incredible. It is absolutely incredible. I can't close without asking a very unfair.
Oh my God, I'm feeling afraid.
No, it's just that uh, ये सही नहीं है कहना कि सबसे पसंदीदा, because some of his works in poetry are just, you know, it's a sea. You could go on and on and on, and it's difficult to just pick up one and say this is closest. पर जैसे मैं कभी भी आंख मूंद कर गालिब का ख्याल करती हूँ तो एक शेर जो यूं आता है, नुक्ता चीक है गमे दिल, उसको सुना. It is so personal. It is, I mean, it's unbelievable how cathartic it becomes for anybody who is clueless about Asadullah Khan Ghalib. That is the magnificence, the magic, the marvel of this man who walked the streets of Delhi and immortalized not only locations but himself for, I think, generations to come. So, आपके लिए कुछ ऐसी वर्सेस, ऐसे नज़में हैं जो आप खुद के साथ कभी कहती हैं कि हाँ, मैं ये कुछ ज्यादा ही करीब लिखा है उन्होंने. This resonates with what I am feeling or I want to address. Please, that would be nice.
जला है जिस्म जहां दिल भी जल गया होगा. जला है जिस्म जहां दिल भी जल गया होगा. कुरेदते हो जो अब राख, जुस्तजू क्या है.
Oof,
हर एक बात पे कहते हो तुम कि तू क्या है. तुम ही कहो कि ये अंदाज़े गुफ्तगू क्या है.
really. बहुत खूब.
Amazing ghazal. Yeah, I mean, it's so. And in the same one, रगों में दौड़ते फिरने के हम नहीं कायल. जब आँख ही से न टपके तो फिर लहू क्या है.
उफ, इससे आगे कोई जा नहीं सकता, मुझे लगता है. इससे आगे कोई जा नहीं सकता.
Right.
Uh, it's been wonderful. I had a fantastic time with CLS Conversations with Meher Afshan Farooqi. I'm going to share some of the observations that I see on my screen. We have Colonel T.S. Chima, who says, I have read somewhere that he was not sympathetic to the freedom fighters during the 1857 First Rising, and the British had to provide him protection. What does your research say about it?
It was the Maharaja of Patiala who provided him protection, not the British. And he was,
Okay,
of course, sympathetic.
right,
Totally sympathetic, yes.
right. And Chima ji कहते हैं, he was an exceptionally handsome man. Did your research somewhere
Yes, yes.
indicate? Yeah.
He was extremely handsome, and he had his complexion was what is called champai, that's
Mm.
like a magnolia. And his, if you look at the one photograph that exists of him, just look at his hands. He had very long fingers and very artistic hands, and he was very handsome. He has been
And yet,
described.
जी, और जब भी उनका जिक्र होता है तो उनकी वो बुजुर्गी की सफेद दाढ़ी वाली पिक्चर
Hmm.
अक्सर, और
हाँ,
famous,
हाँ,
you know,
जी,
the
जी,
headgear. That is what comes to mind. I'm sure you never know. A leaf from your work gets transformed into an audio visual expression and recaptures this absolutely iconic personality called Asadullah Khan Ghalib. आपका बहुत शुक्रिया,
Thank you so
and
much.
from the bottom of my heart, a pleasure. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
everybody for joining us.
And please post the link on my Facebook page.
Certainly,
Thank you
will
so
do.